There are so many things about agave utahensis that you probably don't know. There are so many things about agave utahensis that are super interesting, and I'm a huge nerd about agave utahensis, so I've spent a lot of time reading and researching and visiting these plants and habitat and growing a ton of them from seed and hand pollinating, flowering agave utahensis plants to produce seed, all this kind of stuff. And so today what I want to do is I want to share with you 10 of the least known agave utahensis facts, 10 facts about agave utahensis that you may not know. So the first fact you may not know about Agave utahensis is that it was actually a really important food source for a whole bunch of different indigenous communities that lived in the desert Southwest. Here in Las Vegas, that history goes back thousands of years and is evidenced by the roasting pits that dot the Spring Mountains. I've actually posted a video about some of those roasting pits before. And archaeological investigations into those roasting pits show that they were used by a variety of indigenous communities here. First by archaic desert cultures, and then by ancestral Puebloan cultures, and most recently by southern Paiute communities. And in fact, it was a really important, one of the most important food sources for southern Paiute communities in the area, particularly around the springtime. In the springtime, a lot of other food sources aren't really readily available. The crops haven't begun to grow, they're not ready to harvest in the springtime. A lot of the foods that were stored over the winter have been eaten through over that winter. So the springtime was a really important time in food gathering for southern Paiutes, and that's exactly when agave utahensis is ripe, which I've talked about in roasting pit videos before. And in fact, researchers have postulated that the presence of agave utahensis in specific locations was the primary reason for the archaeological sites now found in those areas for roasting pits and for rock art and things like that. Another fact you may not know about agave utahensis, although at this point it's probably one of the more well-known facts actually, is that agave utahensis is the most cold hardy. It's actually, and this one's a little less well-known, it's the most northern occurring species, and because agave utahensis is the most northern growing agave species and it lives primarily in mountain ranges above 4,500 feet, it actually in many places spends a lot of its time, spends months of the year covered in blankets of snow, which I've posted a bunch of videos and photos and stuff to my Instagram and here on YouTube before. And in fact, the US Department of Energy research, which we're going to talk about a little bit more in a second, has actually found that agave utahensis is cold hardy down to -9 degrees Fahrenheit, which is something like -23 degrees Celsius. A third fact about agave utahensis you probably didn't know is that US Department of Energy research that we just talked about that highlighted its cold hardiness was done on it as a potential biofuel source. You see, most crop plants around the world utilize photosynthetic pathways called C3 or C4. Both of those require the stoma, which are little sort of mouth-like openings, generally in the bottom of a leaf, to remain open during the day so that they can take in CO2, which is required for the process of photosynthesis. But what that means is that moisture can evaporate very readily through those open stoma if they're open during the day. And so many of these C3 and C4 plants are very susceptible to drought conditions, very susceptible to desert heat, high heat and dry conditions, and thus very susceptible to climate change. Now there's a third metabolic or photosynthetic metabolic pathway called crassulacean, I'm probably mispronouncing that, crassulacean acid metabolism, or CAM for short. Agave is one of these CAM plants, and what that means is that basically it only opens its stoma, those little mouths, at night. It takes in CO2, stores it in the form of that acid, and then uses that to photosynthesize during the day when the sun is out. And that results in a lot less loss of moisture, and so makes CAM plants ideally suited for very dry and hot conditions, and thus really interesting when we start to think about what kind of crop plants are going to be successful in an era of climate change. And so agave as a genus has been the subject of a lot of research to try to find new biofuel plants, in addition to agave's other food and beverage and fiber uses. And so because, as we said before, agave utahensis is the most cold hardy agave species, and it's a CAM plant, that means it's a really interesting potential crop for biofuel production. It can be grown much further north than other forms of agave, but it's still going to be tolerant of climate change. Another fact about Agave Utahensis that you may not have been aware of is while we all know that agave is monocarpic, meaning it flowers once in its life and then it dies, what a lot of folks don't know or haven't witnessed themselves is the growth of that flower stalk. Now, Agave Utahensis really grows more than, say, a foot across and a foot tall or so. It's not a very large agave. But in the season that it decides to flower, in the springtime, it starts to produce a single flower stalk from the center of the plant. And it grows this flower stalk over the course of a single season to 10 or 15 feet. And that means that in the springtime, when that stalk is actively growing vertically, it can grow up to 6 inches in a day. In fact, I hand pollinate flowering Agave Utahensis for production of seeds, which you can buy on my website. And I've watched these flower stalks grow, and I've in fact measured them and recorded them, and they can grow up to 6 inches in a single day. Like, you can almost quite literally watch an Agave Utahensis flower stalk grow. Now, another interesting and little known fact about Agave Utahensis is that in the Asian markets, in Japan, where it's a very popular houseplant and balcony plant, there is I guess you could call it a cultivar or a clone there, a legendary clone, if you will. And I'm basing this information on just kind of what I can piece together from talking to folks and what I can find online. But there is a legendary, and we'll get to why I'm doing the air quotes when I say legendary, clone of Agave Utahensis that was brought to Japan sometime in the past called Keiguru. Now, Keiguru roughly means heat haze or heat waves. If you think about asphalt on a hot summer day, and you can kind of look off in the distance, or the hood of a car on a hot summer day, you can kind of see wavy heat lines or heat haze coming off of that surface. And with Agave Utahensis, of course, its spines can get really wavy. And so this legendary clone had really, really wavy spines, and thus was referred to by the person who cloned it as Keiguru. Now, if you go on eBay or Etsy or Yahoo Auctions Japan, you'll find a bunch of plants that are identified as Keiguru. They're being called Keiguru. And I'm told that that's actually technically incorrect, as Keiguru does not refer to the characteristic of having wavy spines, but it's an actual specific reference to a very specific clone that was brought to Japan at some point a few decades ago, and then propagated, probably through offset production, maybe through coring. But in either case, that Keiguru word, which I misunderstood at first when I first started seeing it, I thought it merely referred to plants that have wavy spines, but it actually refers to a very specific clone of a plant, of an Agave Utahensis plant, that was brought to Japan some decades ago. Another fact about Agave Utahensis that you probably didn't know is another line of research. So we talked about how it's been researched for its potential use as a biofuel. Another really interesting bit of research into it is into its anti-cancer properties. There is a class of metabolic byproduct chemicals that many plants produce called steroidal saponins. And these chemicals are produced by agave in response to environmental stresses. And research specifically into Agave Utahensis has identified more than 20 different kinds of steroidal saponins. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. And in fact, these saponins have been found to be anti-cancerous. They can actually cause cell death in cancer cells. And even researchers have found that they occur in a number of different traditional Chinese medicines, and Western research has found that they actually have not only anti-cancer properties, but they also have anti-inflammatory properties, antiviral properties, antifungal properties, and they can stimulate the immune system. So clearly there's a bunch more research that needs to be done into the potential uses of these steroidal saponins that occur in Agave Utahensis. The genus Agave used to be called century plants because early botanists and collectors thought that it took 100 years, a century, for an agave plant to bloom. And while we now know that that's probably not true, in fact most agaves bloom well short of 100 years, Agave Utahensis can essentially live in the wild for hundreds of years. And the way it does that, even though it still is monocarpic, individual plants flower and die sometime between, say, 10, 15, and 20 years, somewhere in that time range, depending on water availability and things like that. But Agave Utahensis is also really cespitose. It means it produces a lot of offsets around the base of the plant, rhizomal offsets coming from the root system. And so when you go out into the wild and you see an Agave Utahensis plant growing in mollisoil, growing in an organic soil that is gravelly and loose, you'll often notice that they occur in these really huge clumps. There'll be one central mother plant, essentially, that's produced a number of rhizomal offsets around the base of that plant. And then each of those offsets has actually started then to produce its own offsets, and then the center plant flowers, dies, and dries up, and eventually will disappear. And the outside ring keeps growing larger and larger. Now, I have a whole bunch of content coming in the future about this. I've done a bunch of research in it. There's going to be more videos and a whole bunch of other stuff. So I'm really excited to get to that. And I'm not going to get into it super in depth today here on YouTube, but I have measured, and I believe that Agave utahensis clones, particularly Nevadensis clones, growing in mollisoils, growing in loose, gravelly soils, those clones can live hundreds of years. Now, that's a little different when you're talking about plants, Agave utahensis plants that are growing like directly from cracks in large limestone boulders, because those plants can't really expand in the same way because they're kind of locked in by that solid rock surface. But again, on gravel, I think there's plenty of evidence, and I'll get into that in future videos and in future content, that Agave utahensis clones can live for hundreds of years. Now, one of the first things that most people notice when they go to see Agave utahensis in habitat is its variability, right? You can look at plants growing mere feet from each other, and they'll exhibit wildly different characteristics. In fact, you'll see some that are have really straight, short spines, growing feet from plants that have really long, wavy spines. And in fact, if you take a picture of one of these long, wavy spines that's growing deep within what's traditionally considered Nevadensis territory, and you show it to folks on the internet like I've done, then you ask them, is this Nevadensis or Eborispina? A lot of people will call it Eborispina, even though it's probably just a really long-spined Nevadensis. Now, there's a lot more about that I could go into, including the fact that the line between Eborispina and Nevadensis isn't really set in stone, and it's probably more of a spectrum based on a collection of characteristics, but that's a topic for a different video that is coming. But I think what's a little bit less known about Agave utahensis is that Howard Scott Gentry, legendary agave botanist, in his seminal book, Agaves of Continental North America, published in 1982, actually talks about that variability as a species trait to Agave utahensis. And he specifically was noticing that Agave utahensis grows what's called a variable inflorescence. Basically, it can have different kinds of flower structures, right? Most plants will typically only grow a species, and this is how species are actually defined, is by their flower structure. So if you see a given plant, you can predict what kind of flower structure it's going to have. Agave utahensis, or most kinds of Agave utahensis, is a little bit different because it can grow one of three different kinds of flower structures. And I've talked about this in the past, but they're basically racemic flowers, spigot flowers, and paniculate flowers. And so Gentry, in his book, says that with study of natural populations, such variation becomes a species character, bringing the whole into perspective. Right, he is specifically saying that the variable inflorescences and the other kind of variability in the leaf shapes and other kinds of morphology are a trait of Agave utahensis. Another fact that you probably didn't know about Agave utahensis is that it grows in something called sky islands. You see, much of Agave utahensis' habitat is actually in the Mojave Desert, which is the driest desert in North America. But it doesn't grow in the hot, dry valleys floors, right? Or at least today it doesn't grow in the hot, dry valley floors. And in fact, sometime, older than 10,000 years ago, earlier than 10,000 years ago, before the last glacial maximum, or what most people refer to as the last ice age, a lot more of the Mojave Desert was much cooler and much wetter than it is today. And so there is evidence that Agave utahensis was growing in a contiguous, continuous sort of habitat range, in a much wider area than it is today. And in fact, analysis on rat droppings, somewhat humorously, around the Grand Canyon shows that something like 20,000 years ago, Agave utahensis did inhabit much lower elevations, and thus probably had a much more contiguous, a much more continuous range across the Mojave Desert. But at about 11,000 years ago or so, when the last glacial maximum ended, when the last ice age ended, the valley floors, most of the Mojave, became extremely dry and extremely hot, and thus Agave utahensis had to essentially retreat up into the mountains, and now today only grows above roughly 4,000 feet in mountains where it's much cooler and there's much more moisture. And what that means then is that each individual population growing up at altitude is separated from other populations, is isolated from other populations by a sea of hot, dry desert that it can't cross. So each individual population that's up in these mountaintops is isolated from every other population of agave by that giant desert sea, and probably has been for at least 10,000 years. And the 10th fact about Agave utahensis that you probably didn't know is that it is most likely the result of a recent field hybridization. Now, as I said, Howard Scott Gentry noticed, and a lot of other folks who look at Agave utahensis have noticed, that it grows variable inflorescences. And typically, that's an indication that a plant is a recent hybridization, a product of a recent field hybridization. Because, you know, a stable species plant generally only grows a single type of flower structure. And in fact, that's how most species are actually identified, is by their flower structure. Now, of Agave utahensis, as we've said before, there are 4 taxa of Agave utahensis. There's what I call regular utahensis, and then, but you know, underneath that there's nevadensis and Eborospina. But then there's another subspecies of Agave utahensis, and that's cababensis, which only grows around the Grand Canyon. And it's the exception when it comes to these variable inflorescences. It only grows one type of inflorescence. It only grows paniculate inflorescences. Those are the much more complicated inflorescences you see in a lot of other larger forms of agave. And that probably indicates that, evolutionarily speaking, cababensis is the oldest form of agave. It is not the product of a recent field hybridization, and thus is probably the parent genetically of the other 3 taxa of Agave utahensis. And again, during that last glacial maximum, when the range of Agave utahensis was much more contiguous, it was not necessarily confined to sky islands, it probably had a lot more opportunity to co-occur, to occur sympatrically with other species of agave. And thus Agave cababensis, Agave utahensis cababensis, may have hybridized with one of these other forms of agave and produced the Agave utahensis subspecies utahensis, nevadensis, and Eborospina that we know today. And we don't know exactly what kind of agave, what species of agave is the other parent with cababensis. And we're not actually even 100% sure if cababensis is the parent, but I think that's a pretty safe bet. But safe bets as to what the other agave parent species is with cababensis is probably something like Agave perii or Agave mckelviana. So I want to hear in the comments down below, what is your favorite little known fact about Agave utahensis? Well, did I surprise you with any of these? Did you actually not know any of these or some of these that I presented today? Let me know down in the comments, and thanks for watching.